Welcome to episode 135 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue our discussion of Epicurus' letter to Menoeceus. This week we tackle the issue of the Epicurean gods. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
The things which are used unceasingly to commend to youth, these do and practice, considering them to be the first principles of the good life. First of all, believe that God is a being immortal and blessed, even as the common idea of a God is engraved on men's minds, and do not assign to him anything alien to his immortality or ill-suited to his blessedness, but believe about him everything that can uphold his blessedness and immortality. For gods there are, since the knowledge of them is by clear vision, but they are not such as the many believe them to be. For indeed they do not consistently represent them as they believe them to be. And the impious man is not he who popularly denies the gods of the many, but he who attaches to the gods the beliefs of the many. For the statements of the many about the gods are not conceptions derived from sensation, but false suppositions, according to which the greatest misfortunes befall the wicked and the greatest blessings the good by the gift of the gods. For men, being accustomed always to their own virtues, welcome those like themselves, but regard all that is not of their nature as alien.
Okay, Martin, thank you for reading that for us this morning. We are going to tackle today one of the thorniest issues in Epicurean philosophy, and that is the issue of the existence and the nature of the Epicurean gods. There's also involved in this section as well an interesting reference in 124 to the issue of conceptions derived from sensation, as Bailey translates it. Immediately when I was listening to Martin read that, most people translate that word as preconceptions or anticipations. And so the discussion of that is something we'll probably hit on some today, but I suggest we probably won't spend as much time on that as we'll talk about just the most important issues of the natures of the gods. We also will want to talk, to the extent we have time, about how we get this information, and clearly the anticipations and preconceptions or prolepsis, whatever words you want to use, are relevant to that. There's many controversies in Epicurean philosophy about what Epicurus was really saying about the nature of the gods. But before we get into the issues that are more heatedly debated and are much more speculative, I think it would be of most benefit to the listeners to the podcast to talk about the basics that everybody agrees on about what Epicurus is saying. What we're talking about here is material that's in Principal Doctrine number 1. It's probably one of the most important issues in Epicurean philosophy is man's relationship to gods. And we want to make sure we hit the basic points before we get lost in the weeds of things that are very difficult to resolve. Because there are very many clear things that he's saying here and clear implications about how people should live. And it makes the most sense for us to be sure we cover those before we get off into the issues that are somewhat lost to us because we don't have as much documentation as we would like to have. We are listing in the thread for this episode a lot of additional information beyond what we're talking about today in the letter to Menoeceus. There's also, of course, the Principal Doctrine number 1. There are many references in other parts of Epicurean philosophy to the gods, including one that people don't necessarily read a lot, but one of the lengthiest descriptions of Epicurean theory on gods is contained in Cicero's book on the nature of the gods. There is a long section by the speaker's name is given as Velleius, who not only attacks the Platonic and other views existing at the time about the nature of the gods, but gives a lot of information that's really not available from other sources to us today about what Epicurus's view really was. some very interesting theories. There's a word called isonomia that is listed in here, and how the gods are related to the issue of images. And one thing that's very counterintuitive is how he says that the images flow to the gods as opposed to flowing from the gods to us. There's many issues on the nature of the gods that could be explored as well. Then there's Epicurus' riddle that everybody knows about to some extent. And there are references in Diogenes of Oinoander's inscription on the wall that are also relevant. And we'll try to cover as much as we can. Again, to bring it down to a focus, Epicurean theology, I think everybody will agree, starts with the premise that there are no supernatural gods, that any gods that exist are natural parts of the universe. They're composed of atoms just like everything else in the universe is. And so before we get off into the parts that are difficult, there's a lot of basic material here that we can contrast against Christianity, Judaism, Islam, other mainstream religions of today to sort of set the stage about where Epicurus fits in the great scheme of comparison of those views. So let's try to start off about that, because he says, first of all, believe that a God is a being immortal and blessed, even as the common idea of a God is engraved on men's minds. Who wants to start?
Well, I might just start with that first sentence, because we did talk quite a lot last week about how the introduction in this letter is quite different from what we saw in the letter to Pythocles and the letter to Herodotus. And we didn't get much of an introduction here, but we do get a little bit more in this first sentence. He says, "The things which I used unceasingly to commend to you, these do and practice, considering them to be the first principles of the good life." And so there does seem to be some connection between Epicurus and Menoeceus, more than maybe we imagined in the last episode, given the very terse introduction. So this is apparently part of a thread of conversations that goes back in time, and we don't know how far, but I think it's the case in this letter, as in all of the letters, that he's not just speaking to Menoeceus here. Epicurus used his letters as a way to address not just individuals, but whole communities in cities that he couldn't be everywhere at once to expound his philosophy. And so letters are a means for him to address communities, much in the way that St. Paul would later come to use his letters. And by later, I mean about 3 or 4 centuries later. And then there's that, again, the goal. We talked a lot about happiness, and here he describes it as the good life, which doesn't give us a whole lot more to work on. But it's clear from this that we're not looking for just a way to put off the misery, as you might find in Marcus Aurelius, for example, who's shrouded by commitments and duties and obligations. As emperor, he's far away from home on the warpath when he's writing his meditations. And he really seems to be in that book just looking for a way to get himself out of bed in the morning. That's not the image that we get from Epicurus. And that's not what he suggests to the people he's writing to. He's writing to Menoeceus because he wants him to live a good life, whatever we decide that means. And he thinks that he's found a way through his philosophy to allow Menoeceus and others like him to find their way to that good life, which otherwise might be very difficult.
Joshua, I would follow on with what you just said by emphasizing again that, yes, he's telling readers of this letter that these are the first principles of a good life. And I don't think that when you say, I'm going to give you a list of principles of the good life, and I'm going to give you this one first, that's a means of emphasis. I don't think he's saying once you understand it, you can forget about it. I think he's saying that it's important for you to regularly be thinking about these things that are the principles of good life and applying them. And even though you're going to apply his statements about the gods in a way that allows you to not worry that they're going to destroy your life or control your life, that doesn't mean that you just file it away on a bookshelf after you understand the point. One of the things that to me is important here is that Epicurean theology is an integral part of the philosophy, and not just necessarily as an antidote to a particular pain. It's something that is part of what you're going to be thinking about on a regular basis.
Yeah, and of course, some people may remember from the last episode that he immediately precedes this sentence by saying that neither when young nor when old should you put off the study of philosophy. And so that seems to me to be just what you're saying there, Cassius, which is that the right time is always now to study philosophy. You need to have an understanding of how to approach the idea of the gods at all times. It's not just something that you learn once and then don't think about anymore. And probably as you continue to think about it, your understanding or your idea is going to change a little bit over time. And I think a little bit later on in this episode, we're going to get into some of the different ideas that people have about the gods, and perhaps more interestingly, some of the different ideas that Epicureans had about the nature of the gods.
Right. So let's dig into the specifics by going into that next sentence where he says, first of all, believe that a God is a being immortal and blessed. And then he repeats that at the end of the sentence by saying, do not assign to him anything alien to his immortality or ill-suited to his blessedness, but believe about him everything that can uphold his blessedness and immortality. So if this translation from Bailey is correct, there's three separate statements here that the major attributes of a God are, number one, immortality, and number two, blessedness. Now, blessedness is not a word that we probably have a very specific meaning of in our mind. But to go back to what I said at the very beginning, I think we should emphasize that if the primary characteristics of a God are immortality, deathlessness, and then blessedness, he's not listing omnipotence. He's not listing omniscience. He's not listing these other attributes that we in the modern world, influenced by Christianity and monotheism, by Abrahamism, that we attribute now to God. Epicurus' work in the Greek context of the way the Greeks thought about Zeus and the other gods at that particular time. He's simply saying that the major characteristics of gods are their ability to avoid death and their blessedness. So we can wipe out of our minds, from an Epicurean point of view, the idea that God created the universe, the idea that God created mankind, that God put Earth in the center of the universe as the central focus of his plan. We can put out of our mind that God knows everything, that God has his finger in everything, that he knows the number of feathers on the back of the sparrow, that he determines everything from the beginning of time, that he predestines man to certain things. Now, we'll deal with heaven and hell next week, but we can put aside all of those things that we most commonly associate with the idea of a God from this Epicurean perspective. Does anybody disagree with that or have any subtlety to express on that? Does this opening passage here not basically wipe away most of what the modern world thinks in terms of what a God is? Is it fair to infer from this description in 123 and 124 that the gods of Epicurus are very, very different from what we think of in the monotheistic perspective?
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. And there's basically two lines of evidence for this. One of them is the writings of Epicurus himself, like the letter that we're reading now. The other line of evidence is the pushback that he got from his contemporaries and from later thinkers and writers about his view of the gods. This isn't like one of the things that you have going on, particularly in the United States, is the Temple of Satan or the Church of Satan, who will, anytime you've got this issue of the Ten Commandments going up on a government property, they want to put their Baphomet statue up because they're trying to illustrate that free speech is not the exclusive domain of Christians, that it should apply to everybody. But this is quite a combative and argumentative way to approach things. I'm not passing judgment on whether it's right or wrong, but Epicurus is not necessarily taking that approach. He's certainly offering a very, very different view of the gods and what they are and what they're like, what their nature is. But he presents it in terms that are so mild. And so it's almost hard to argue with him here. But of course, people did.
Maybe we should talk for just a minute about this word blessed. If somebody were trying to argue with this presentation, they might say that, well, he says gods are blessed, and that means gods have supernatural powers. I think that's probably not a fair reading of the word blessed to suggest that it means anything more than just sort of perfectly happy.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. The Greek word is makarion. And I was just looking to see where else that pops up, but I don't really have the time to do that right now.
Yeah, we can get that in the thread. And as he's describing that, when he says immortal and blessed, we do have another reference to this issue of the preconceptions. The phrase is, quote, even as the common idea of a God is engraved on men's minds. Now, that is likely a reference to what is discussed in the Velleius material of On the Nature of the Gods. Again, trying to postpone the discussion of controversies until we cover the major points, the idea of whether the common idea of a God is engraved on men's minds and the idea of whether we have preconceptions or anticipations about them, or whether we actually can determine things about gods from the receipt of images, which we've discussed a little bit in the past, but is also relevant to the God situation. The sources of our evidence about the gods are something we should defer, but the bottom line is that he is saying very firmly that gods are immortal and that they are blessed. He's not giving any other attribute to them other than that.
Let me take the word blessed here, because we've been trying, in the last episode, the word we were dealing with was happiness or eudaimonia. In the first part of this text, we're dealing with the good life, and then we get blessedness. These, to me, are all wrapped up in basically one identity. The good life, according to Epicurus, to my understanding, is a life of blessedness. And if you could attain the kind of life that he imagines the gods to live, that would be not just the good life, but the best life. And so a blessed life is the best life, or it is supreme happiness or supreme eudaimonia. That's the life of the gods, to my understanding.
Okay, and I have a feeling maybe the best way to do this is just to talk at least a brief period about each of these sentences and then reserve at the end for our excursion into controversies. The next sentence says, for gods there are, since knowledge of them is by clear vision. But they are not such as the many believe them to be, for they do not consistently represent them as they believed them to be. And the impious man is not he who popularly denies the gods of the many, but he who attaches to the gods the beliefs of the many.
When I read the sentence, for gods there are, since the knowledge of them is by clear vision, the immediate question I want to ask is, do you have a clear vision that the gods exist? That's the question I want to ask, but Cassius, I don't know if you want to get to that yet. That's the statement that Epicurus is making here. He says, for gods there are. Now, there are many people today, many people who consider themselves Epicureans, who would take issue with that language. For gods there are, since the knowledge of them is by clear vision. Does that represent your experience with the gods? Do you see them by clear vision, or do you understand them to be by clear vision?
So let's go ahead and talk about for gods there are, since knowledge of them is by clear vision, and just stay with that sentence for just a moment. Presumably it relates to what's said in 124 as well. Let's go ahead and just talk about the things that seem to be the evidence parts of these two issues. He says, for gods there are, since knowledge of them is by clear vision. That is a statement about how we get evidence of the gods. Then the next two sentences are really probably not evidence statements. But then 124 says, for the statements of the many about the gods are not conceptions or preconceptions derived from sensation, but false suppositions. And then he goes on and talks about how they're false. But he's listing here a couple of statements, this statement about clear vision, and then he's talking about preconceptions derived from sensation, or I'm going to use the word preconceptions. Everybody else does besides Bailey, I think.
I think you're right, Cassius. I think it is supposed to be preconceptions.
Yeah, I think it's Bailey's putting his finger on the scale and slanting it in the direction he wants it to go. So we've discussed before the episode started, how many of us really can say that we have knowledge of the gods by, quote, clear vision? And probably there's not many of us who would say that we do have clear vision of the gods. And if we did say we have clear visions of the gods, we would question that person's sanity to some degree.
I think Bailey makes here a poetic translation. I don't think he means his clear vision that we see them with the eyes. So if you compare this with Hicks' translation, it's more like this. If you hear an explanation and you understand it, then you say, I see. So it's more seeing it in this way, which is meant here. So we probably need to know about the Greek original, what is meant. But if we take Hicks as a reference, there is no statement of clear vision or indicating that we see it literally with the eyes. So it's rather that it's manifest. No? Yeah, it's written there as manifest.
That's an excellent comment, Martin, because yes, let's read the Hicks version. For verily there are gods, and the knowledge of them is manifest. What you just said, Martin, I think extremely well stated, because you can look at a particular translation and a choice of words and put so much emphasis on that particular choice of words and just come totally away from what is probably the more reasonable meaning of the sentence. The word, I think, is idiom. When you say you have a clear vision of something, that doesn't necessarily say you're seeing it with your eyes at the moment in front of you. It just means that you have a clear understanding of it, perhaps. And when Hicks says knowledge of them is manifest, that's much easier to accept, I think, for most of us than to say that we have a clear vision.
There's another area in this text further up in 123 where we kind of have the same problem, because Bailey says, even as the common idea of a god is engraved on men's minds.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of problems with that sentence. But if you go to Hicks, he says, according to the notion of a god indicated by the common sense of mankind. I also have some problems with that idea. But in Bailey's translation, it's the difference between the active and the passive, in my view. If the common idea of a god is engraved on men's minds, what that implies to me is that if there's an engraving, there has to be an engraver. This is starting to sound a lot like creationism, or what they now call themselves, the intelligent design movement. See, the reason that I have so much internal resistance to the way that Bailey phrases this is because we've all heard Christians use something very similar. God's laws are written on men's hearts. You don't believe in God, but you know that you're sinning because God's laws are written on your heart. Well, I don't accept that idea. I don't accept the idea that the common idea of a God is engraved on my mind. And I don't accept that the notion or existence of a God is indicated by the common sense of mankind. Or maybe I just don't have common sense when it comes to this issue. I don't know. But the point is, there's a difference here that I'd like to articulate. The Christian will tell you that God's laws, his moral laws, which are, according to Christianity, moral truths, moral absolutes, are engraved on your heart. And therefore, that when you break those rules or laws, not only are you committing sin in an absolute sense of the word, you are also doing so with foreknowledge, because even if you've never heard of the Judeo-Christian God, that's a phrase I don't like to use, Judeo-Christian, but even if you've never even heard of Yahweh, his laws are engraved on your heart, so you know you're sinning. The Epicurean view here, while I still don't like it, is completely different. He's not saying that God's laws are engraved on your mind or on your heart. He's not saying that there are any sort of transcendental moral laws or truths that the gods impart to us. That is completely foreign to Epicurean theology. And to conflate the two would be greatly dangerous. So we have to demarcate that line, in my view.
Joshua, when you said a moment ago that the Epicurean view, even though you may not like it, whatever, I think what we're now into is a great illustration that we should not rely on a single translator, or even to some extent, even a set of translators. When we start with something that is clear, and the Epicurean physics really is clear. There is no supernatural God. There is nobody creating the universe. You've got a set of presumptions there that have to play out in this ethical section as well. And so when he talks about clear vision or engraving or something like that, you've got to read it very, not skeptically, that's not the word, but you've got to read it very carefully and make sure that you're not bringing into what you're reading or what this translator has written, that he hasn't brought into it some Christian or theistic notion that was not there. What Martin said a minute ago about clear vision, it really jumps out at me. I remember one of the few sections in Lucretius that I've managed to memorize a little bit over time is the section in book 1 where Lucretius starts talking about what Epicurus stands for, and something to the effect that Epicurus is one who stood up against religion and so forth. But the Latin is humana, and then the two words ante oculos, which is some kind of a statement of before your eyes. I think that's what Martin's talking about, that there are these idioms of using words like it's before your eyes. Why can't you see it? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're observing it at that moment, but that it ought to be clear to you because of all the evidence that you've got. So I think that's the first task in reading the letter to Menoeceus, no matter who the translator is to make sure that we're not slanting it according to our own modern monotheistic understandings of the way we expect Epicurus to have been talking.
Okay, so I think this might have come up in a thread on the forum about how there were in the temples, there were statues, and like, for example, the statue of Athena, very tall statue. I wish I had the numbers of how many feet tall the statue was, very large, so that there's a cultural experience all around the religious aspect that was going on in ancient Athens. And that whole time, culturally, people were affected by the sight of these temples and the sight of the statues within the temples, and that this created an effect on their minds. And so I think it's important to take that into consideration about this idea about the gods. It could have been almost like a psychological phenomenon happening because of the whole cultural system there.
I agree fully with it.
Yeah, I think I understand the idea. And if you look at Egyptian engravings on walls and stuff, or on statues or obelisks, they'll have these images of a seated king or god king or pharaoh or demigod or whatever, and then a bunch of people standing in front of him, sort of as, he's the lawgiver and they're taking the law, that kind of thing. And the seated figure of the god king will be just as tall as the standing figures of the hoi polloi, as we might say, of the people. And so that if he stood up, he'd be taller than them, maybe even twice as tall. And so this difference in scale does have, I think, a psychological effect. But certainly, if you situate yourself into the mind of a Greek peasant farmer in the 3rd century, and you imagine this person living in more or less a hovel, and they're spending their days out in the fields, and they're, bringing in the harvest, and everything they do is tied to nature, and they're living a life of essentially poverty. And we know that Epicurus did not come from a wealthy family. His parents were not people of means. They were actually fairly poor. For someone like that, then to walk into one of these amazing ancient buildings like the Parthenon, and immediately as you approach this building, the sheer structure and grandeur of the building, it would have had a huge psychological impact, I think, on a person's mind. And then to go into this building and to see this giant statue in gold leaf of the god, that would have had a huge impact, I think. And then later on, when you've got the Library of Alexandria and they're coming up with all these interesting mechanisms, almost like clockwork, or you've got, what would you call it, hydraulics. This stuff was not really used industrially or economically, but it was used in the temples. They would rig this up in such a way that the door of the temple would open and close hydraulically. But you wouldn't know, as a peasant farmer living in the fields surrounding Athens, you wouldn't know that this was a hydraulic system. What you would see as you approach this was the house of God, the doors of the house of God opening and closing on their own. Now, a person today would immediately detect the imposture because we're surrounded by illusions constantly. But for a person in that time to see something like that would have had, I think, an immediate and clear effect. And they could wind up these little statues on hidden wheels. They'd wind them up with rope, and then as they unwound, they would move across the room. And then as they unwound completely, the bag of sand would then lift up, and then it would drop down. And then on cue, this statue would then withdraw. You see this stuff happening as a person who had never seen something like that before, and it's got to have a tremendous impact on your mind. And maybe the best example we have is the example that we get from Lucian about Alexander the oracle monger and this snake that he used as sort of a physical embodiment of the god Glaucon. And he rigged this up in such a way that he had this papier mâché head of the snake. So the actual head of the living snake would tuck into his shirt, and then out from under his arm would pop up this papier mâché snake head that was very realistically wrought, particularly in low light. And then there would be a mouthpiece in the snake, sort of a Think of like one of those old gramophones that would amplify sound, and then that would go through a series of pipes into the room behind, and then somebody behind would be talking into the other end of the pipe. And you would think that the god snake was talking to you directly and in person. And so there's lots of reasons to think that it would be apparent common sense to most people that these things were real, even though they were evident charlatanry. I hope I haven't taken that in a completely different direction, Colosini, from where you were going, but to discard all of the mechanical part of it and just to take the statue of the god herself, that alone would have had, I think, a huge psychological impact.
Okay, yeah.
But so my takeaway here generally is that what we have to draw a distinction between is the epistemological claims of Epicurus when it comes to the gods, and we have to contrast them with the ethical and moral claims that religions like Christianity make about the gods or about God. Christians are claiming that the moral laws of God are self-evident to humans, and Epicurus is making the claim that epistemologically we can have knowledge of the gods. But he's not making claims about moral laws that the gods are handing down. The Epicurean gods don't do that. That's not the function. They didn't create the universe. They don't have any control over it. They don't interfere in the lives of human beings. And their primary purpose in Epicurean philosophy is to serve as an example of the blessed life.
There are so many different directions that we could go in. But before we go further down the line we're talking about, let's just make sure that we've covered the rest of what he's saying in 123 and 124 before we start extending it too far. Because I think the part we have not covered yet is that the gods are not as the many believe them to be, for they don't represent them consistently. And the impious man is not he who popularly denies the gods, but attaches to the gods the beliefs of the many. That's probably worth some comment right there. There's a whole book called On Piety, I think, by Philodemus. I mean, clearly Epicurus was, according to many sources, participating in certain of the public rites, which would have had at least some religious aspects to them in his day. So there appears to definitely be an Epicurean aspect of the word piety. So maybe we should talk about that in that way for just a minute. What is piety to Epicurus? Is it purely a negative statement of denying attributes about gods, or is it, I don't think you'd use the word impiety if you were just saying that they're wrong about what they're saying. You'd use probably another word. What is Epicurean impiety? Joshua, can you take that one? I know you're conveying a lot of the different issues that we're struggling with here. Is the word impiety something that is in Epicurean terms similar to what we would consider it to be in other religious terms?
I think that what we've been talking about in terms of the demarcation between epistemological claims and moral or ethical claims applies also to this idea of impiety. Epicurus seems to hold the idea that to attach to the gods traits like jealousy, lust, adultery, capriciousness, vengeance. Anyone who's read the Iliad and has seen the interplay between the humans and the gods and between the gods and the gods, the idea that the gods take sides, or that the motives and interests and actions of human beings are just the sport, almost the emotional sport of the gods, that is the idea, in my view, that Epicurus seemed to think was impious. To think that the gods were so capricious that they would take this human, Paris, and use him to judge between the beauty of gods and mortals. And then if he chooses the wrong thing, then all the goddesses who didn't get chosen start this campaign, and then it ultimately leads to the Trojan War. That's the kind of thing, the capriciousness of the gods is something that Epicurus decisively rejected. And it comes to a head, particularly in Lucretius, with this idea that the gods are going to demand human sacrifice in order to placate them, and that the style of that sacrifice is going to be the sacrifice of a child by its parent.
Okay, now you're saying that he's rejecting those ideas and considering them to be wrong. But what about the word impious? Doesn't that word imply some kind of a sacrilegious aspect?
Yeah, but again, it's impious to have a false epistemology about the gods. It's not impious to disobey them. That's the distinction I'm drawing here. And what I read this as is not necessarily, Epicurus didn't come up with the word impious. He's not going to start an inquisition to go around and start killing people if they don't agree with his idea of the gods. What he's doing is he's taking the issue of impiety, which was hugely important. In fact, one of my favorite Socratic dialogues is Euthyphro, which is all to do with how we understand impiety. And so he's taking this entrenched cultural idea of impiety that people are slinging not only at each other, but predominantly at him. He's taking all these barbs from the Platonists, from the Stoics, from the leaders of the cities that he's in. People are accusing him of being impious. And so I don't read this as Epicurus coming up with the idea of impiety and then trying to enforce it. What he's doing is he's taking an allegation that's made against him and, in essence, accusing the accuser.
I don't know that I have a different suggestion than what you're just saying. I think you've really covered the major point. Another reference that came to mind while you were talking, Joshua, is Lucretius, Book 6, and it's line 68 in the Latin, and it says this: "Unless you purge your mind of such conceits and banish them from your breast, and forbear to think unworthily of the gods, by charging them with things that break their peace, these sacred deities, you will believe, are always angry and offended with you. Not that the supreme power of the gods can be so ruffled as to be eager to punish severely in their resentments, but because you fancy those beings who enjoy a perfect peace in themselves are subject to anger and the extravagances of revenge, and therefore you will no longer approach their shrines with an easy mind. No more in tranquility and peace will you be able to receive the images, the representations of their divine forms, that form from their pure bodies and strike powerfully upon the minds of men. From hence you may collect what a wretched life you are to lead." So there's a thread of statements and numbers of sources that talk in these almost religious terms about if you have thoughts about the gods that are unworthy, that ascribe to them duties and business that no true God would really perform, that there's a negative result of that.
Yeah, but the victim of your impiety, if we accept those terms, is not the gods, right? It's not that you're going to drive the gods into a rage and then they're
Right.
going to run through your life as if you were Job and kill your children and do all that. That's not going to happen, because the gods, according to Epicurus, don't do that. The victim of your impiety, if you accept those terms, is you. Mm-hmm. It's your own peace of mind that you are threatening when you talk about the gods in terms like that.
Okay, this is probably the point in the episode we should go ahead and explicitly talk about the fact that there are very serious differences of opinion about what Epicurus is really saying in these passages as to whether gods exist in physical form or not. You can sort of divide down the different perspectives into, some people take the position that everything that Epicurus is saying here is a mental construct, and that what we're talking about in terms of God-like beings or gods are sort of idealistic ideas in our minds that don't really exist in the physical universe. That's one major category. And then another major category would be those who say, absolutely, Epicurus did say that physical beings exist in the physical universe, which are immortal and blessed. And there's a lot of controversy about whether one of those two is clearly the superior position to take, or whether the evidence is just not clear. And this is one of the areas that we're really missing text to really be more confident of which position is which. But let's go ahead and jump into that thorn bush. Is Epicurus really saying that physical beings exist? At this point in the podcast, I hope we have hit hard enough, and maybe I'll say it one more time. Nobody says that Epicurus held supernatural beings to exist. Nobody says that Epicurus held that omniscient or omnipotent beings who can perform miracles to us and so forth. Nobody's saying that Epicurus held that. And so a lot of people will then take the position, well, that means Epicurus is an atheist. And that's only if you define the word atheist in a sort of modern monotheistic sense, because the Greeks had a far different vision of what gods are than the Judeo-Christian world or the Islamic world, the Abrahamic world. And we don't doubt that the Greeks really believed that Zeus existed. At least most Greeks seem to have been very sincere in their belief that Zeus and these other gods really existed. And yet their definition of their God was very different than what you'd be taught in church today in a Christian environment. So this appears to be, under anybody's perspective, a different definition of what a god would be. Epicurus was not accepting the common Greek definition of a god, nor was he accepting the Abrahamic definition of a god. So I hope we've hit that hard enough. And so as we talk about whether these beings really exist or not, we're not talking about whether Yahweh exists or not. We're not talking about whether Allah exists or not. Probably, whether we're arguing for it or not, somebody may have a better way of describing the sort of idealistic position than the way I just described it. Would anybody want to describe it differently?
Right. So I do take the view that, because there's another point, Cassius, that you left out, which is, did Epicurus just say that he believed in the gods to keep off the authorities?
Yes.
That's another view. My view on this is that Epicurus really did think that there was an order of existence higher than humans. In fact, I would go even further. He thought that there was an extensive order of beings throughout the universe, because the universe is infinite, it's eternal. Things are constantly being thrown up by nature. So you've got stuff happening all over the place. And you've got, just as we have very lowly forms of life, single-celled organisms, that kind of thing, on Earth, we expect to find that kind of thing in other places in the universe. And just as we have intelligent organisms on Earth, you expect to find intelligent organisms throughout the universe. And I think that Epicurus really did believe that there was an order of intelligence. And I think the word he uses, it's translated as immortality, but I think incorruptibility is another way to put that. And the importance of the word incorruptibility is it has to do with the incorruptibility of the physical form of the god. So I really do think that Epicurus thought that there was an order of existence, that it was physical, just as everything in nature is physical. There's nothing non-physical except for the void. So I really think that Epicurus thought that the gods existed in physical form, and that they existed maybe all over the universe, depending on how you take his view of worlds and the intermundia and all that. But I do think that Epicurus thought the gods were physical. There is this other train of thought, which we call the idealist view. And I think it centers on this Greek word eidolon, from which we get the word idol, I-D-O-L, translated generally as images. And so the idea from the idealist perspective on the existence of the gods is that these are images that we have in our minds of the ideal state of the good life, the ideal blessedness, the ideal happiness. That if you imagine for yourself a being, which you can call a god, who would live the kind of life that you're trying to live, but who could attain that life in a way that maybe it's not possible for humans to attain, and who could attain that life over a period of an eternity, that it would be useful to reflect on the supposed existence of that being, because it's something for you to strive towards.
The analogous situation there, Joshua, is one of the Vatican sayings, I think, says something to the effect that reverence for the wise man is of great benefit for he who does the reverencing, something to that effect, meaning that just like when you play tennis or do any activity in life, if you surround yourself by people who are better than you are, who already know how to do it, you can learn by their example. All sorts of different analogies you can use to the benefits of setting up a goal to which to aspire to and keeping that goal and that vision in your mind.
And this is something, Cassius, that people do all the time. If you're a football player and you want to get better at playing football, you're going to go to games and watch people who play football better than you do. You're going to watch what they do, and you're going to try to emulate how they do it. You're going to watch tapes of games going all the way back to the 60s because you want to see how the best players of all time have played the game of football, because you're trying to get better at it. The idea here seems to be that we want to emulate not just better happiness, but the best happiness, the perfect ideal state of happiness, which again is probably not attainable for human beings, but that if we emulate it can get us closer to our best form of happiness.
What you just said there, Joshua, is pretty much what I was attempting to emphasize in the beginning about how I don't think the Epicurean doctrine of gods was intended just to be a negative thing where you throw out supernatural gods and then you just put it aside and never think about it again. I think it had in the Epicurean scheme this function that you've just talked about, this function of keeping in front of you on a regular basis an ideal towards which you would aspire. You could even call that a technique, perhaps, since the Stoics are so big into techniques. You could potentially think of this as just one of those things you would do on a regular basis to try to improve what you're doing so that you just don't get caught in a rut of the same thing day after day. You should always be aspiring to a more successful, pleasant life.
So the question is where we go from here. Martin, let me ask you a question. Do you spend time in your day imagining a perfectly happy and incorruptible God and then trying to strive toward living a life like that God? Do you find that helpful?
For me, not. No, I don't. I completely don't do that at all.
Yeah, I'm absolutely the same way. What I do find helpful, and maybe I'll just illustrate this point, what I find helpful is just thinking about nature itself, the raw form of nature, atoms and void. I find it helpful to think about the vast immensity of space and time. That's the kind of thing that helps me to put my finite, tiny, minuscule existence into perspective and to think about, okay, given the allotment of time that I have, which is going to be a flash of a microsecond in evolutionary or in cosmic scales, what am I going to do with the time that I have? And I don't find it helpful to imagine what an incorruptible and blessed God would do, but I do find it helpful to just put that time into perspective and to think about the time that it takes light to come to us from the nearest star, much less the nearest galaxy, which is so incomprehensibly far away that it's very difficult for the human mind to imagine. This is the kind of stuff that I find helpful. So I'm very skeptical that the gods, if we take the ideal view, are necessary for that. And I'm even more skeptical in taking the physical view, because I just don't think that a being exists that we would call gods. I think that the idea of the gods is too wrapped up. And of course, Epicurus didn't have to do with the baggage of monotheism, but I think that the baggage is real and it's problematic. It's so problematic, in fact, that just thinking about the gods becomes a hindrance more than a benefit. That's my view.
Joshua, I'm a little bit surprised to hear some of that from you, because I kind of associate you with more of an artistic and even poetic bent. You know, art is such an interesting subject in itself, about the things you surround yourself by in your day-to-day life. Do you surround yourself by sort of, I don't know if you want to say heroic imagery or that is something to aspire to, or do you not? I think there are many people who might suggest that one of the negative aspects of our current civilization is just people who sit around every day and do nothing but watch television shows, and they will adopt what they see on television, which often is probably not the highest art that's possibly available out there. And they'll internalize the things that they see. Maybe, again, we're not talking about the cream of the crop in terms of the intellectually aggressive people, but if we're talking about normal people who aren't constantly engaged in philosophical explanations and research, they probably are more affected than other type people by the things that they see around them. And if they're in ancient Athens or if they're in Nashville, Tennessee, and they go up and see that huge building like the Parthenon, and they go inside and see these huge gods and so forth. Calasini posted to the forum recently, Don and Calasini were talking about Horace and how Epicureans are supposed to be fond of the countryside, and to some extent that might mean fond of a simpler lifestyle and so forth. I can see it argued that people of a simpler lifestyle are probably even more affected than all of us who are constantly battered by images everywhere. They could be very affected by seeing statues of gods and the way that those gods are posed, whether those gods are smiling or not. I think is recorded in one of the Epicurean positions that we should portray gods as smiling. I could see the idea that surrounding yourself by images of what you aspire to is a pretty important thing to do. Now, whether we do it or not today is a different question, but it could in fact be a very helpful thing to do to make sure that our pictures and our things we see around us every day are positive and uplifting images of what we would like life to be instead of the opposite.
You said artists, and I myself being an artist, there is something there with regard to sort of image of gods and goddesses in the creative process, even now in time where we have monotheism surrounding us, but yet the human psyche is not, I would say it's not monotheistic. The psyche has many aspects to it. So, for instance, Joseph Campbell, he brought up the idea of archetypes, and he was studying various cultures and their religions and their beliefs and all the different gods and goddesses, all in all world religions. So there's this element of looking, even for the modern artist right now, there's an element of looking to creativity, that there's a source of creativity in the images and the ideals of what these images can represent or bring up. In fact, going back to ancient Greece and the muses were, well, the idea was that inspiration came from the gods. So that's a whole thing which I have not studied fully enough. But the idea is that the muses are the source of your creativity. So there is still this connection in some psychic way between gods and goddesses. It's hard to explain because this is not something that people go around talking about. But I'm sure if you asked any artist, is there some element of inspiration, and you really dive deep into what that was, you would see some common archetypes coming forward that would relate toward the ideals of perfection and beauty and all the things that good art come from.
I could take your question here, which is finding inspiration in the idea of the gods. And then you mentioned things like art and architecture and poetry and all that. I think that the province of finding inspiration for me comes from human culture. It comes from art and architecture and poetry. It comes from something as simple as fantasy or science fiction literature. There are these worlds you can escape to. Video games are quite important to me. So there's a lot of areas where if life is maybe lacking in inspiration, where you can retreat to these worlds. And of course, I love Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve. I know it's very controversial, but one of the things he describes in his book is the way that these Renaissance humanists were trying to resuscitate this ancient world of the Greeks and the Romans, the world that we study on this podcast, the world that we study when we study Epicurean philosophy. But they didn't have access to it the way we did. We have access to it because of the things they did to bring it back. But when you read the letters, for example, of Poggio Bracciolini, the guy who rediscovered the manuscript of Lucretius in 1417, I think, in a monastery in Fulda in Germany, it was like opening a new wing on a library, which you can go into when there are things in your life that maybe are not as satisfying as you would hope. And Poggio's letters are rife with that idea. He'll talk about things that are going on in the world that he despises, like the killing of heretics, for example. He thought that was repulsive, particularly heretics who were well educated, who spoke Latin, and who were highly intelligent and articulate. And so he would see these things happen. He was at the Council of Constance. He saw people led to the stake and ultimately executed. And in his letters back home to Florence, he would describe what he was seeing. And then he would say this interesting transitional phrase. He would say, but back to the books. So the world he lived in was deeply unsatisfying to him. So he retreated into this almost artificial world, the world of Cicero, the world of Homer, the world of Epicurus in some ways, and Lucretius. And so I don't need to reach for an image of a god in order to come up with something to give me a new perspective, or something to lead me to pursue something better or more fulfilling, to pursue something that will make me happier. It's not required. And as I said earlier, Epicurus didn't have the same kind of baggage surrounding the issue of divinity that we have, because I think Calasini is right. There's a huge difference between a pantheon of polytheistic gods and a monotheistic god. And to write in a culture of polytheism and to then offer this new interesting take on the gods, I can see where there would be a lot of value in that. But we are now, in a sense, poisoned by the poison fruit of Abraham. And so when I look for inspiration, I essentially see two choices, and it's Athens or Jerusalem. I will always choose Athens. If I'm not choosing Middle Earth or Dune or something like that. There's all these worlds that we create, but the world of the gods is not interesting to me if I try to imagine them actually existing in reality. That would be my take on it.
Joshua, I really like the line of thinking we've been talking about for the last few minutes here, because the way I would reconcile what you're saying, Joshua, and what Calasini is saying would be that I'm like Martin. It is absurd to me to think about spending time considering the nature of Jehovah. God is love, or whatever. All this monotheistic view of divinity that we are subjected to in the modern world, it's been drained of all specificity or all ability to relate to it at all. God has become such an abstraction. I guess to some extent people would argue that that's why Jesus is more important, is because you can wear your "what would Jesus do" armband and think about it in terms of modeling your life after Jesus. And I guess to some extent that's kind of what we're talking about a little bit here. That's much more relatable, at least, than it is to think about God and trying to model your life after God. There's just such little ability to do that it doesn't make any sense even to try. But the analogy of the way some people look at Jesus probably does make more sense, and maybe that's more the direction we're talking about here, is that not in any sense a supernatural way, but keeping in front of you a vision of the way you want your life to be, the way you want yourself to be. If you're a child or a high school football player, like you used the analogy earlier, have a picture of dating myself, all these people like Johnny Unitas or Joe Namath, or people that I don't know the names of modern football players at all. But that's what people do when you're younger. You hero worship. There's obviously bad things about hero worship, but there's good things about hero worship if it gives you a goal to aspire to and helps you work towards that goal. And what I hear you saying, Joshua, and what Martin said previously, is that we are not able to do that with the God of Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, and so forth, just because of the nature of that particular God. But if you're coming at it from the Epicurean perspective and you're familiar with the way the Greeks looked at their gods, I think it's much more possible to see how that could work and how that could be an important part of life. To some extent, if Epicurus is developing a worldview that is going to appeal to wide groups of people, he's not just appealing to the philosophers who are spending their time buried in books. He's appealing to normal people out there in the normal world and thinking about how to give them ways to relate to the universe. Okay, we're probably beginning to come to the end of the normal episode length. So let's, rather than try to go down too many new roads, talk about summarizing the roads we've been on.
Just one more comment. I'm not sure whether in the long talk it has been mentioned already, but what my understanding is of what usually what I heard, nowadays Epicureans in Greece, they think those ancient gods as being symbols for something what those gods represent. And in this way, they can still be valid today, and in that way they were also valid for Epicurus at that time. So that means by looking at this as a symbolism, there is no difference between ancient Epicurean philosophy and modern Epicurean philosophy as these Greek Epicureans see it.
Yes, I've heard that kind of thing too. I think you're right, Martin.
In fact, we have a forum friend in Athens. She lives in Athens, right?
Thessalonica.
Okay, you're right. She recently had a grandchild, and the grandchild is named after one of the 9 muses, which I thought was very interesting. So I certainly see that kind of thing. I am an occasional poet, and I have written many verses on Venus, the planet, because usually I'm walking around at night looking at the stars, and Venus is always very prominent if you see it in the sky. I think it's the 3rd brightest object in the night sky. And it does give me some kind of, I guess, rumination or reflection to think about Venus and what it meant to think that Venus was a god and what it meant to discover that Venus was now a planet. And it's this interesting interplay of something in nature that is carrying the characteristic of something very human. And I do find that interesting, and I have written on it quite extensively. And so every time I see Venus, it's like my heart lifts just a little bit. I guess I can see that kind of thing as being valuable. And of course, metaphor is hugely important to me. And so Lucretius has a passage where he talks about when you think of Bacchus and Ceres as wine and, cereal grains and that kind of thing. So I certainly see the value in that stuff. It's not like I'm total curmudgeon when it comes to the imagery of the gods. And then there's this further idea that you get in Lucretius, and indeed in this very letter, of thinking about nature as being not just an inert sort of sterile, lifeless matter, but being in many ways sort of the generative mother of everything that exists. And that I find extremely compelling. And it's compelling because actually there's modern Christianity is I see this quite a lot. I was raised Catholic. I have Catholic family members. The reference to Mother Earth, which people sometimes make quite casually, there's a lot of pushback to that idea from Catholics today because they are hugely concerned about people confusing the creation with the creator. And the ultimate takeaway for me from this passage about the gods in the letter to Menoeceus is that there is only the creation. And ultimately, the word creation isn't even right because it was uncreated. There's only nature. There is no creator. That, to me, is the key point we have to take away here.
Well, continuing on with that analogy just briefly, the issue of just using an image or something as an example to aspire to, somebody looking back into that, book 3 of Lucretius starts out by talking about Epicurus and how they considered him to be a father-like figure. So that would be another example of a father figure. In this case, there's also a question you discuss about whether Epicurus himself fits that description or not, but the Epicureans certainly considered him in that kind of a way as an example by which to follow. And then basically there's also the book 5 introduction, which says that Epicurus was essentially a god himself because of what he had done for us as humans and how he had shown the way out of the dark path of religion and so forth. So there's lots of material that provides analogies of, again, there's that word hero worship, which has all sorts of negative connotations to it, but a father figure is not necessarily so negative. And it's easier to understand how it helps to think about what some figure that you hold in high regard would do in any particular situation.
Yeah. Now, the thing about Epicurus, Cassius, is that he's not twice as tall as us.
That's right.
when we talk about, these statues or these Egyptian hieroglyphics. There's a passage in Lucretius in the Latin. It says, Nos exequat victoria caelo. We by the victory are exalted as high as heaven. That's Rolfe Humphreys' translation. I was interested when I was reading Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare that there's a line in Romeo and Juliet where after Juliet dies, Friar Lawrence said that she is now as high as heaven. And I saw that and I immediately thought of Rolfe Humphreys. And now I genuinely don't know if Rolfe Humphreys was using this phrase from Shakespeare to translate Lucretius or if Shakespeare was taking some influence from Lucretius when he wrote that poem. I think he absolutely was, because there's also references to wormwood, to dreams. There's almost this line for line passage on dreams from Lucretius, his description of little atomies. There's quite a lot in there that I'm absolutely loving when it comes to Lucretius.
And that's all in Romeo and Juliet, or just different?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm going to go around and ask for final comments, but without jumping ahead in the letter, we have to remember that how does the letter to Menoeceus end? Meditate, therefore, on these things and things akin to them night and day by yourself, with a companion like it to yourself, and never shall you be disturbed, waking or asleep, but you shall live like a god among men. And that's kind of a famous line in Epicurean phrasing. So in a sense, even this letter concludes with the call to consider yourself and aspire to be a god among men.
Yeah, let me get something in here on that, because throughout this episode, I might have sounded like I was totally poo-pooing the idea that what we're talking about here. One of my favorite authors, of course, is Henry David Thoreau, and he read about the first 100 lines of Lucretius and reported that in his journal. And he said that the most interesting part to him was this image of Prometheus. Of course, there is no image of Prometheus in the first 100 lines of Lucretius. There's a discussion of the Grias Homo, I think he calls him. He's talking about the Greek man Epicurus. And Epicurus, in effect, stealing fire from the gods. That is something that I find hugely inspirational. The idea that how does he say it? He's rending the tight-barred gates of nature's hold asunder. He's wringing secrets out of nature, and he's passing them on to us, and then he's defiant toward the gods, and by his victory, we are exalted as high as heaven. So that kind of thing I see a lot of value in.
Joshua, I don't read what you've been saying today as being curmudgeonly about the subject. I think the point, and I'm glad you raised that, because I think what people might hear and people might expect, supernatural religion has been a poisonous influence. And that is the Epicurean perspective. Whether we agree with it or not, it's clear. Much of what Epicurus was doing was combating the negative effects of religion. But the interesting thing is, this is a contrast that I regularly draw. The famous modern atheists who are constantly campaigning against religion, maybe they want to suggest some kind of a humanistic view to replace religion. But this modern atheist movement is mostly negative, at least in the way I look at it. I don't think Epicurus was wanting to stop at just simply refuting bad ideas about supernatural gods. I think he was interested in pursuing a positive side to thinking about this subject. And I know it's hard for us to do anything but deal with the negative, because we've been living under what we consider to be oppressive or generally negative influences our whole lives. And we tend to associate negative things that go on in the world with the negative influence of supernatural religion and the discord that comes from it and so forth. But I think that that's an interesting thing that we can get out of Epicurus, is that it's not just a negative subject to talk about or think about the nature of what divinity is or would be like, that you can get something positive out of it. And even though we're not really used to doing that, that's probably one of the things that additional study into Epicurus might give us interesting new paths to pursue. Okay, so with that, let me go around and ask for closing statements from everybody. And we generally start with Martin. So, Martin?
No, I have none today.
Okay. Calasini?
Yeah, so this has been very good, because I see now that this is a very important aspect that I've been kind of just pushing aside as far as understanding what place gods and the idea of gods have in Epicureanism. And as you had said, Cassius, in the very beginning, this is at the very start of the letter. So that means this is actually very important. And so as I reflect on everything that we've said, I realize that for me, this idea of gods, or I could also say archetypes of gods, it's something that I need to go back and look at again. So the gods as ideals. And it's been such a long time since I studied Joseph Campbell, and I'm thinking I really need to go back and do that again as an artist, that this could actually enhance my life. And I've thought of myself so much as an atheist that anytime I see the word God or gods, I'm just like, whatever. But coming back to really studying this, I see maybe I'm missing something that would actually be very beneficial to increasing my happiness in life and increasing my inspiration and improving my art. And so this has been very, very helpful for me. So thank you.
Okay, Joshua.
Okay. So as some of you may know, I did take a brief tour through Buddhism, and Calasini has been there as well. There's this image surrounding the Buddha's enlightenment, the stories that sort of have grown up around that event. And one of them is that was his name Mara, the tempter, appeared to Buddha and tried to draw him away from the path of enlightenment and all that. And there's this particular moment where the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, he's sitting in sort of a lotus position, meditation pose, if you can imagine, and he's resting a finger on the ground. This is called the Earth Witness Mudra. Mudra is like a pose or an arrangement of the hands in statuary. This is actually quite important in Greek statuary as well, that the way you hold your hands can indicate whether you're a philosopher or an orator or a statesman or a soldier. And the image is of the Buddha calling the earth to witness. So he's got this tempter who's trying to stop him from achieving his goal, and he puts his finger on the ground, and it's sort of as if all the beings of all the worlds who want to be freed and need him to take the first step are crying out against the sort of almost Satan figure to leave him alone so that he can do the necessary thing that he needs to do. The Earth Witness Mudra was always my favorite sort of statue of the Buddha. And so what I guess I'm trying to say is that I do find that kind of thing helpful. And it kind of dovetails with my image of less focus on the gods and more focus on the issue of like a Prometheus figure, someone who is clearly working on the side of the humans.
And so when you say that, Joshua, you raised that earlier about the Prometheus figure, and that is Epicurus himself in the first sections of Book 1 of Lucretius, right?
Yes, He doesn't give Epicurus his name, but he says, first a man, a Greek, he goes on to say that he climbed the flaming ramparts of the world and crossed the bounds of space and time and thought and brought back news of what could be and what could not. And I wouldn't be doing this podcast if I didn't find the story of Epicurus himself inspiring. And I didn't find the quest that he took in many ways to seek out the grounds of not just choice and avoidance, but of the study of nature and of epistemology and physics and of how we know what we think we know is true about the world that we live in. If he hadn't gone to the trouble of doing those things and then brought them back for us so that we can read them and profit from them. And so that would be where I would put my focus in lieu of the gods. But yeah, I guess that's going to be my closing comment.
All right. And let me remind you, as my closing comment would be the end of what you've been quoting there. So his force, his vital force of mind, a conqueror beyond the flaming ramparts of the world, explored the vast immensities of space with wit and wisdom and came back to us triumphant, bringing news of what can be and what cannot, limits and boundaries, the borderline, the benchmark set forever. And then these are the final words I wanted to add. Religion so is trampled underfoot, and by his victory we reach the stars. So there's always in Epicurean philosophy this interplay with proper view of the gods and where they live and how they live. Okay, we'll close for the day with that, and we'll come back in another week. So thank you, everybody, for your time today.
Very good.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.